I'm Mary Braybeck, and I'm Dean of the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all here today. This is a forum that brings together practitioners in K-12 systems, higher education systems, the press, the funders, the foundations, the ed policy people, and students. And as I look out at this diversity in our attendance here this morning, I'm really pleased to see so many of the next generation who are considering these really important questions about education policy and the implementation of new standards and new tests. And that's our topic for this, the 15th year of Education Policy Breakfast. We've been doing these for 15 years. We always take one theme, and this year's theme is testing, the good, the bad, and the ugly of it. And I'm really pleased to welcome today two wonderful colleagues to help us address this question of testing. And George Noell is here, and Howard Wainer. They will be introduced in a minute by Sharon Weinberg. Sharon's at the table with them, and she will be our moderator today, and I'll introduce her in a moment. But I just want to say that I had the great pleasure of serving on a task force with George Noell that was a task force of the American Psychological Association that looked at the use of standardized testing, growth models, and value-added modeling, survey data, and observational data in evaluating teacher education programs. What are the considerations, and how can we implement evaluation of teacher education programs in a way that is rigorous but also fair and stays within the limits of the confines of the statistics that we use. So I hope we have a chance to ask him some questions about that area too. And Howard Wainer is here, and Sharon will tell you about his many, many books and her favorite book, but I just want to mention my favorite book that Howard has written. It's called A Statistical Guide for the Ethically Perplexed. And I recommend it to you as a counterpart to your statistics courses that you're taking, especially you graduate students, because it brings an ethical lens on the questions of probability, of regression to the mean, of correlation, of the difference between collecting data and reporting data, and is a wonderfully insightful and ethical book. And I think you're going to hear some of his perspectives through his comments this morning. So please, as you listen to our speakers and as you participate today, please use your social media to send out the message. Here's our hashtag, NYU EPBS. EPBS is Education Policy Breakfast Series. So please tweet, post, take photos, send them around the world. Debate is at the very heart of these education policy breakfasts, and raising difficult questions and looking at difficult questions from different perspectives is really critical to our being able to move forward in an informed way on education policy issues and education practice issues. So please engage in this debate. We will, each speaker will present, and then we will have at least 30 minutes for discussion, as we always do. We anticipated an informed and a very energetic conversation this morning. So let me turn to Sharon Weinberg now, who is a professor of applied statistics and psychology and has served in the provost's office as vice provost for faculty affairs at New York University. She has authored numerous articles and books and reports, and has written on statistical methodologies, statistical education, evaluation, and applied areas also, such as clinical and school psychology, special education, and higher education, and a particularly wonderful report that was published in the Educational Researcher on retirements and trends in higher education. As I say, we are aging out. She's got a textbook called Statistics Using SPSS, an Integrative Approach, that is co-authored with a former graduate student, Sarah Knapp Abramovitz. And I should say Sharon typically publishes with graduate students as a way to mentor them into the scholarly world. She's also the author of Diversity in American Higher Education Toward a More Comprehensive Approach. And Dr. Weinberg is the recipient of several major grants, including a recent grant from the Sloan Foundation to evaluate the New York City Gifted and Talented programs. She's a member of the editorial board of the Educational Researcher and chairman of the board of the Jewish Foundation for Education of Women, or JFU as we fondly call it, a foundation that really tries to support the educational aspirations of women. So please welcome Sharon.
Well, thank you, Mary, for that introduction and for hosting this breakfast series. I'm delighted to be here today to moderate this morning's session and to welcome you all to what I know will be a most interesting and informative set of talks by our two panelists, Howard Wainer and George Noell. The fact that we are such a large crowd here today no doubt speaks to the reputation of our two distinguished panelists and the importance of today's topic, the benefits and consequences of educational testing as it applies to educational policy making and the assessment of teacher preparation programs, teacher effectiveness, and student learning outcomes. Our first speaker this morning will be Howard Wainer. He is a distinguished research scientist at the National Board of Medical Examiners and emeritus professor of statistics at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. He spent 21 years as a principal research scientist in the Research Statistics Group at Educational Testing Service and previously served on the faculty of the University of Chicago and in the Bureau of Social Science Research. Dr. Wainer has a long-standing interest in the use of graphical methods for data analysis and communication, robust statistical methodology, and the development and application of generalizations of item response theory. His books include Uneducated Guesses, the one that you heard Mary talk about, a statistical guide for the ethically perplexed, and most recently, Medical Illuminations, published this year by Oxford University Press. And I just read a review of it, and I reviewed his Uneducated Guesses for TC Record, and I think that's a fabulous book, and certainly this, and Mary is recommending the second book. And so certainly this third book promises to be as good, if not better than the rest. In any case, Dr. Wainer is a fellow of the American Statistical Association and AERA, and he has received awards for his contributions from ETS, the National Council on Measurement in Education, and the American Psychological Association. So Howard's talk today is based on the book Uneducated Guesses, and as I said, that as a reviewer of that book, I can say with confidence that through concrete examples, Howard will make amply clear to you this morning the importance of sound evidence based on test scores for generating educational policies. The title of his talk is Uneducated Guesses: 3 Examples of How Mistreating Missing Data Yields Misguided Educational Policy. Howard.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I see some people with cameras. Please don't take any pictures unless you have the lens on that makes me look younger and thinner. I have plenty of those other ones and I don't need any more. The title is different than what that Sharon said. Because I originally thought of this as an hour talk, and then I was told it was not going to be an hour, so instead of 3 examples, it's 2. And let me leave this on so you can copy it down while I talk a little bit about motivation. Last night at dinner, Professor Noell, George to his friends, was telling me about a problem that he has when he speaks to various decision makers, whether they're in the legislature or in the executive branch, and he would present facts and graphs and tables, and they would nod, agreeing, and then they would say, yeah, but my cousin Susan, she did very badly on those tests, and she's a doctor. And then the aphorism came up, well, the plural of anecdote isn't data. Well, it's a clever grammatical play on words, but in fact, the plural of anecdote is data, but it's not evidence. Because data are anything. If I wanted to know your math ability. I could collect your shoe size. I could collect your hair color. I could collect all sorts of things. And they're data for sure, but they're not evidence. Evidence is data related to a claim that you want to make. And usually, evidence has to be gathered in a more rigorous way to know what goes into what are the things you collect and what are the things that you missed. And so what I'd like to talk about is two things. First, a little epistemology, and I know epistemology before 9 o'clock in the morning is probably a mistake. But let me, the idea of empiricism, reaching back and using evidence to make your decisions, is an old one. I guess it starts with Aristotle. Everything started with Aristotle. But then it died out. Even Aristotle had problems in that he concluded that women had 28 teeth. Because it made sense. Women are more delicate creatures, have smaller heads, they don't have as many teeth. He had 2 wives he could have counted. But he got away with empiricism because he had Alexander the Great watching his back. But once Alexander left, that was it. And then empiricism died down until the fabulous Bacon boys, and Francis Bacon being and even there it disappeared until the British empiricists, Hume and Berkeley and so on. And that was when suddenly statistics and graphics came in, because if evidence didn't mean anything, why would you want to know how to manipulate them? And so it's a relatively new thing. If you Google the proper noun, evidence-based medicine, the earliest reference you'll find is 1992. If we only used evidence in medicine starting in 92, what were we doing before then? If it wasn't evidence-based, what was it? I claim it's faith-based. But my boss, who's a physician, said, no, it was, sort of carefully designed. Anyway, so I'm going to cite as my epistemological source the iconic physicist Richard Feynman, who said, in general, we look for a new law by the following process. First, we guess it. Then we compute the consequences of the guess to see what would be implied if this law that we guessed is right. Then we compare the result of the computation to nature with experiment or experience, compare it directly with observation to see if it works. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. And that simple statement is the key to science. And that's why empiricism is so tough, because the ugliest fact can destroy the most beautiful theory. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is missing data. And now missing data sounds like the habit of some persnickety statistician. Who cares? What does that really mean? It's just something. So what I'd like to do is first I'll give you some examples of what missing data does and how it can have profound effects and how you can deal with it. For those of you who fall asleep, let me give you the end of the story right now. And that is, the magic of statistics can't put numbers where there aren't any. So when data are missing, the only way you can fill it in is by going out and gathering some that are not missing through heroic efforts, or making heroic assumptions. You can't have some magical statistical thing that's going to do it. Oh, don't worry, we've got double YX inverted something or other. No, that nothing works. And then I'm going to give 2 examples. The first one is what happens when the SAT is made optional. And that's a good example for people who are saying, well, do we really need these tests? You have to think about Henny Youngman when he said, how's your wife compared to what? So tests tests certainly have all sorts of problems, but compared to what? What's it like without them? And then, so the use of not using the SAT and what happens when you don't use them is a useful idea. And then the second one is what happens when you want to use test scores to evaluate teachers. Now, I actually know about the so-called value-added models for doing this. I know a lot about them. And I'm a statistician, and I love tests. And I think using tests to evaluate teachers is a really awful idea. But I'd like to not just say it's an awful idea because it hurts. It's an awful idea for reasons, and I'd like to go through some of those reasons. So let me start out. I'll start out in 1835. Can you still hear? If you can't hear me, raise your hand. See, that's an example of missing data. You could hear me. You raised your hand. In 1835, no, it's fine. Let's keep me. You know, this way I avoid any embarrassment if my fly isn't closed. In 1835, a Swiss physician named Henri Lombard, published a paper. He had collected death certificates over the course of his career, and he had accumulated about 4,500 of them. And on each death certificate was the name of the man, they were all men, his occupation and his age at death. And so then he calculated the average age of death for each occupation, and then published a table about that. I've translated if you don't, I don't know what your French is like, so I've translated the occupations. Happily, the one in which the average age of death of 73.6 were for people who made chocolate. That's reassuring. And then after that, hosiery makers lived to be 69. Casters, a lot of these have to do with making watches. This is, after all, taken from Geneva. We're 59. And the most dangerous profession, with an average age of death of 20.2, were students. Now, I've used this at a graduation talk to congratulate them of getting out of this terribly dangerous occupation and moving into something safer, like skydiving. Now, what happened? Why did they get 20.2? It's because of missing data. And that is all the students who didn't die and became something else. Now, what's interesting is that Lombard looked at this and he recognized that was an anomaly. But then he accepted all the others. Now, if you look at the next one up, which was a merchant's assistant, of course, if you died while you were an assistant, you weren't something else. So what's missing is really absolutely critical. When my son was in 9th grade, he had a project. He went around the Princeton Cemetery, which opened in 1750, and wrote down the birth and death date of every tombstone in the cemetery. And then he subtracted one from the other and got the age at death and made a plot of them as a function of what year they were born. And here's the plot. And what we were expecting was to see gradually life expectancy to increase over time. And in fact, it does that a little bit, and then it falls off the table. And when I show this to people, they say, oh, probably that's when Princeton Cemetery started letting in poor people, or there was a flu epidemic, or what was going on. No, it's because of missing data. If you were born in 1980 and you're in the Princeton Cemetery, we can be sure of two things. One, you're young, and two, you're dead. The people who are not in this, the missing data, are the ones who were still alive that were born in 1980. And so my point here is that this is a profound effect. The missing data is a profound effect. And if you ignore it at your peril. It's not some subtle little thing. You know, you say, well, we got 70% response rate, so that's okay. Because the other 30% is just like what we got. Or more particularly with education surveys, we have a 23% response rate, and we're missing 77%. So what? Well, so what is a big deal. Now, it's said that there are two kinds of lawyers. There's the kind that tells you can't do it, and the kind that tells you how to do it. You know who you hire. So far I've come across as the wrong kind of lawyer. Let me give you an example of how to deal with missing data. Here's the problem. You have to forgive me, I've got a thing. A man named Herman Wald was tasked during World War II with figuring out where to add armor to airplanes. And the planes would go off on missions and they'd come back, and when they came back, he would carefully keep track of where the bullet holes were in the plane. And he did this for a long time, and when he was done, he concluded that they needed to add armor to wherever there weren't any bullet holes. Now you're looking puzzled. Think about it a little bit. Think about it with respect to missing data. He's looking at planes that came back, not planes that didn't come back. What's missing? The planes that didn't come back. If they came back and there was a bullet hole in a certain place, they could make it back with a hole there. And so what he did is he made a graph, and he took an outline of a plane and put a dot on the outline wherever there was a bullet hole. And when he was done, he found out that there were 2 areas where there were no holes. One was under where the pilot sat, and the other was where the fuel tank was. And so how did he arrive at this conclusion? It was because he had a model for missing data. And the model was that the planes were hit more or less uniformly everywhere, and the ones that didn't come back were the ones that were hit in these places. But he could be wrong. Now, how can you tell if his model was correct? There's only one way. I mean, it makes sense, but a lot of things make sense. In education policy, most policies only make sense if you say them fast. This one, the way to do it is you go out and it's what's called sampling from the unselected population. You go out and you find some planes that didn't come back and see where the holes are. And you say, well, that's hard to do. Yes. When you're dealing with non-responsive surveys or missing data, trying to solve it, you can't do it with statistics. You have to actually do something. All right. So now let's get to education. That was the point of this, isn't it? Yeah. In 2008, the New York Times carried the first of 3 articles about a report that the National Association for College Admissions Counselors, NACAC. I love that. It sounds like something from Philadelphia. And they made a bunch of recommendations, and these recommendations are the kind that, as I say, only make sense if you say them fast. And one of them was that schools should consider making admissions SAT optional. And that is allowing students to submit their SAT or ACT scores or not. And they had all sorts of perfectly fine reasons, having to, a lot closely akin to women have 28 teeth. Well, let's look at some data. And let me, in Bowdoin College is a small, highly selective college in Maine. I always thought it was, only a third of a college. It was Bowdoin, Bates, and Colby. Because they said, where are you going? Well, Bowdoin, Bates, and Colby. We're going to go visit. And they've had a policy of SAT optional for a long time. And they said it works fine. They said, well, they actually didn't look very carefully, but they said it works fine. So I actually looked. And the first thing I did is I looked at the average SAT score for Bowdoin as opposed to, and compared it to some other schools. And so here, this is for the entering class of 1999. And Bowdoin had 379 students, of whom 273 submitted SAT scores, and their mean SAT score was 1323. That's the verbal plus math. And 106 students didn't submit. And you can see where they ranked relative to Northwestern, Carnegie Mellon, Barnard, Georgia Tech, and Colby. The difference between Colby and Bowdoin is interesting because those 2 schools are, by any measure, are identical. Why should there be such a big difference in the average SAT score? And so a natural question to ask is, okay, how did the kids do who didn't submit their SAT scores? How did they do at Bowdoin? I mean, if they did well, it meant whatever other variables they were gathering, whatever information they were gathering, worked. So I went and I looked at what their first year graduate schools, first year grades were. And the other question, which is a harder question, is would you have been able to predict their performance based upon their SAT scores if you had their SAT scores? Now that we don't know the answer to because we don't have their SAT scores. So let's look at the first one. And as it turns out, in terms of performance at Bowdoin, the kids who didn't submit SAT scores did worse than the kids who did, by about a half a standard deviation. So whatever they're using to admit these kids isn't compensating for it. Or the kids who don't submit SAT scores had other things going for them. And you can imagine, maybe there was a goalie, or they played the oboe, or had, who knows, there's all sorts of things. But the interesting thing turns out to be that all of those kids, every one of them, without exception, took the SAT. They just chose not to submit it. And Bowdoin did, so Bowdoin didn't know what their scores were, but I did. I went and looked and found out what their scores were. The question that comes up is why didn't they submit their scores? And who knows? So there are some reasons. If I don't need to submit them, why bother to take them? That's certainly one possible reason. I took them and did really well, but so what? I'm not going to send them in. I've got 800, but I'm not going to do it. or I took them, but did worse than the typical student who was accepted by Bowdoin in the past, and submitting them wouldn't help my cause. Now, that's a plausible reason, but again, we don't know, but that's the one that I would choose. So anyway, I went and I looked at their scores, and I'll skip all of this. And so here's what they did. This is the distribution of the kids who submitted their SAT scores and the ones who didn't submit them. This is the distribution of their SAT scores. And it turns out they did about a half a standard deviation worse than the kids who did submit them. Or in other words, they're behaving completely rationally. I didn't do that well, I'm not going to send it in. I mean, why would you? It turns out that you can predict their performance at Bowdoin better with their SAT scores than you could have predicted for the kids who submitted them. And that, of course, is what you'd expect. So the question immediately comes up, why would a school choose ignorance over knowledge? Why would you prefer to not know this? And there may be lots of reasons. And I have one. And here's the same table I showed you before, but now it's augmented. And so where it has the SAT scores of the school, it has the SAT scores of the school with all the kids, not just the ones who submitted it. And so you see that with Bowdoin, the kids who submitted their SAT scores were 1323, and the ones who didn't, it was 1201. Now, if you put those two together, the mean for Bowdoin College is 1288. So they're no longer the second highest. They're down tied for next to last. They're tied with Georgia Tech. Now, one of the things we know is that the US News and World Report rankings have average SAT score as an important component. And so you can game your ranking on the US News and World Report by making the SAT optional, because one of the things you can be sure of is that all the kids that score 800 are going to submit them, and the kids with lower ones aren't, and they can do that. Now, Bowdoin didn't do this because they had this policy before US News and World Report started their rankings. I can't say the same thing for other schools. I thought I had discovered a trick. I thought I had discovered something, that schools were using this kind of policy to game the system. And then I decided that I was being silly and pompous. It turns out that one should never assume that some subtle, modest manipulation is used when instead you can get large changes much more easily. Because US News and World Report get their information reported to them directly from the schools. And so the schools can report anything they damn well please. In 2013, a number of prestigious institutions admitted falsifying the information that they sent to US News and World Report, also to the US Department of Education and their own accrediting agencies. Claremont McKenna College simply sent inflated SAT scores. Bucknell admitted they'd been boosting their scores by 16 points for years and years. Tulane upped theirs by 35 points. Emory used the mean scores of all the students that were admitted, which included students who opted to go elsewhere. They also inflated the class ranks, and there are lots and lots of other examples. So maybe you could use some subtle trick like this for boosting scores, but why bother? Just say, everybody did great. All right, so that's example one. Example two is using student test scores to evaluate teachers. This sounds like a good idea. Let me quote one of my favorite educational philosophers, Marvin Bressler. Some professors are justly renowned for their bravura performances as grand expositor on the podium, agent provocateur, and the preceptorial or kindly old mentor in the corridors. These familiar roles in the standard faculty repertoire, however, should not be mistaken for teaching, except as they are validated by the transformation of the minds and persons of the intended audience. Transformations of the intended audience. That's how you evaluate teachers. So it sounds like a great idea. Well, what is a transformation? We look at their score at the beginning, the kids' score at the beginning of the year, the end of the year. The difference is the teacher. Now, what are value-added models? I apologize. I'm going to go through this fast. The one I'm showing you here is a very simple one. It's called the layered model. It's used in Tennessee, and it's filled with subtle and wrong assumptions. It starts with the idea that the score of a child I in time period 1 is equal to mu sub 1. That's the score based on the school effect. Theta sub 1, the teacher effect, and epsilon sub I1, that's the student effect. In the second year, you have a similar thing, and there's a carryover of the previous teacher, undiminished. Well, that's clearly silly. I mean, most of us have had teachers that their effect ended the moment you left the classroom, and others have lasted for 30 years. So it's hard to know exactly what that is. But they put this in. They put it in because if you subtract one from the other to get the value added, last year's teacher drops out, because the theta 1 goes away. And so that's why it was done. It's just convenient. It's not a very good model. A more reasonable one looks like that. I'm not going through it. I thought of Saul Bellow when he got the Nobel Prize. He said, "The child in me was delighted. The adult was skeptical." And then I thought of Samuel Johnson's dog. I was impressed not because it did it well, but that it could do it at all. It can't do it very well. The estimates are awful. But the fact that it can do anything is pretty impressive. Now, there are many challenges to be overcome before these value-added models work. And there are psychometric issues, there's statistical issues, and there are epistemological issues. I'm going to focus just on the missing data issues. And the missing data issues show up in two different places. One, when a student doesn't take the pretest, or the post-test, or both, or the connection between the teacher and the student is missing. You don't know what that is. There are all these various sorts of missing data issues. And the other one is the counterfactual data. And that is, whenever you want to measure a causal effect, what we're interested in is what happened under the circumstances that we've observed. You had Mrs. Jones and you gained 10 points, versus what would have happened had you had somebody else. That's the counterfactual. So we'll come to, and that's missing, because we never know that. Now, here's the part that people go to sleep, so please hang in. There are two approaches to dealing with missing data. The first one is to use only those students with complete data, and then assume that the estimates of the teacher effects are okay. And now what that means is the students that aren't there, who have missing data, who don't have complete data, are just like the ones that did. And so that is exactly the opposite of what Herman Wald did with his airplane. If he assumed that the planes that didn't come back are the same as what the ones that did, he would have put the armor everywhere where there were bullet holes and gotten it exactly wrong. So that's a bad idea. A more common method is called imputation. What imputation means stick in a number. Where there's a missing number, you put in another one. And now which one do you put in? Well, one is to put in the mean of all the people who have a score. And so if everybody else in your class got, they averaged 88, we'll put in an 88 for you. Or you can do something fancier where you put in a score based upon covariates. All the other students, the mean of all the students who are like you, and put that in. And that has a lot of advantages. But the problem is that it can be gamed. How is it gamed? The answer is field trips. If I was a principal and worried about the rankings of my school, of me and my teachers, I would have a field trip for all the best students when the pretest is given. So they're gone. And we have to impute something. So what do we impute? We impute the score for all the people who took it, the bottom half of the class. But it isn't fair to have a field trip for those kids and not for the others. So at the end of the school year, when you have the post-test, I would have a field trip for the bottom part of the class. And what gets imputed for them? The mean of the scores that's there. Now, I get guffaws, just like this, when I mention this, but occasionally I look around and there's a few people taking careful notes. And I usually append the obiter dictum that if I could think of the scheme, the school administrators in the field whose career advancement was riding on these results would surely be more inventive. Sadly, I was prescient. On October 13th, 2012, Manny Fernandez reported in the New York Times that former El Paso Superintendent Lorenzo Garcia was sentenced to prison for his role in orchestrating a testing scandal. The Texas Assessment of Knowledge and Skills, TAKS, pardon me, is a state-mandated test for high school sophomores. The TAKS missing data algorithm was to treat missing data as missing at random. That is, the people who took the test are just like the ones who didn't take it. So that's the way they dealt with it. And if you know that in advance, you can game it. And so what he did was students were identified as likely low-performing, were transferred to charter schools, discouraged from enrolling in school, or were visited at home by truant officers and told not to go to school on test day. But it didn't stop there. Some students had credits deleted from transcripts or grades changed from passing to failing, so they'd be reclassified as freshmen and so avoid testing. And sometimes students who were intentionally held back were allowed to catch up before graduation with something called a turbomester, where they could sit down in front of a computer in an hour or two, make up the missing year, and graduate on time. Superintendent Garcia boasted of his special success at Bowie High School and called his program the Bowie model. And the school and its administrators earned praise and bonuses in 2008 for its high ratings. Parents and students called the model Los Desaparecidos, that disappeared. It received this name because in the fall of 2007, 381 students were enrolled in Bowie as freshmen. However, the following fall, the sophomore class was 170 students. It's like Chile. They're gone. A sub-problem is when students choose not to answer some items. This happens frequently when a student's performance on a test has no direct impact on the student, say NAEP or new teacher evaluation exams like those that are given in New York. If a test has no immediate impact on students, and for high school seniors even if it does, they tend not to try very hard. And for evidence for this, you look at the non-response at NAEP. Non-response increases with student age. Younger students try harder. Non-response varies with item type. Multiple choice items are answered more frequently than constructed responses or essays. It varies with ethnicity. Asians and Jews tend to answer questions. It varies with location. Students in South Dakota answer more often than those in California or Hawaii. And non-response rates can run as high as 70% for 11th grade essay items in Hawaii. And you can understand why. Here's this test you have to take, but whenever you're done, it has no bearing on you, so whenever you're done, you can leave, and surf's up. And there it is. This came up in California some years ago where they had something called the Cash for Cap program. And that was students would take a test, and depending upon their performance, the schools would get extra money. And so a senior class representatives went to the principal and asked for a share of this money that they were going to be getting to augment their senior prom. The principal rejected it and said, this was in, I think, is it pronounced Ojai or OJ? Ojai, thank you. And said that the money had already been slated for improved computing resources. And most of the senior class handed in blank essays coupled with randomly selected options and to the multiple choice items, and they left early. There was no money. Anyway, the biggest challenge is causal inference. And again, now I'm going to come back to epistemology in a more serious way. Value-added models aren't interested in descriptive statements like Freddie gained 10 points when he was in Mrs. Smith's class. The goal is to make causal statements like Freddie gained 10 points because he was in Mrs. Smith's class. That's what they're really interested in doing. See, description is no problem because Freddie did gain 10 points. The question is why. So let me do a little bit of epistemology. A counterfactual conditional is a term that refers to any expression of the general form, if A were the case, then B would be the case. That's the conditional part. The counterfactual part is that A must be false or untrue in the world. And some examples of this: if kangaroos had no tails, they would fall over. If an hour ago I'd taken 2 aspirin instead of just a glass of water, my headache would now be gone. Those are all counterfactual conditionals. And then, of course, the most obnoxious statements in English are counterfactual conditionals. If I were you, I... And of course, the appropriate answer is you're not, go away. So let me go back to Hume, and he made a discussion, he has a discussion of causation. This is famous. We may define a cause to be an object followed by another, where all objects similar to the first are followed by objects similar to the second, and this is the important part, where if the first object had not been, the second would never have existed. That's the counterfactual part. So let's return to student testing. Suppose we find that a student's test performance changes from a score of X on the pretest to a score of Y after some educational intervention. We might be tempted then to attribute the pretest post-test change, Y minus X,
to the intervening educational experience, that is, to use the gain score as a measure of improvement due to the intervention. That's the essence of value-added models. That's the essence of VAM. Now, there are many other possible explanations for the gain y minus x. Some of the more obvious ones is simple maturation. For example, suppose the statement was, Freddie grew 5 inches when he was in Mrs. Smith's class. What would he have gained if he had been? He would have probably grown 5 inches. Or there could have been other educational experience during the same time period. Gee, your kid had a great gain in French while he was in Madame Smith's class. Oh, he wasn't in class that much. Okay, we were in France. That's. Yeah. Or there were differences either in the tests or the testing conditions in the pre and post tests. There's this famous aphorism: if you want to measure change, don't change the measure. And yet we're always changing things. From Hume, what we see is that what's important is what the value of y would have been if the student not had the educational experiences that the intervention entailed. We can call that y star. Those are the counterfactuals. And so y star is not directly observed for the student. She did have the educational intervention. And so asking what her post-test would have been had she not had it is asking for information collected under conditions that are contrary to fact. So it's not y minus x that has any causal interest, but the difference y minus y star. And the gain score has causal significance only if x can serve as a substitute for the counterfactual. And you never can know that. I mean, it can be more credible, but it's very hard to do. So let me sum up so you can have, so George has his time. First, missing data is an unavoidable complication. Can't get away from it. Ignoring them, assuming missing at random, doesn't often lead to a happy outcome. The best solution, if possible, involves a special data gathering effort. For example, the thing we did at Bowdoin to go and get the SAT scores for all the people who didn't submit them. This may not be practical on a large scale, so you have to pay very careful attention to those complete data sets when you can get them. So even though I didn't look at all of these universities who don't require SAT scores, even a little one is very helpful. When you're gathering the missing data, and when gathering missing data isn't possible, that is the counterfactual performance of students had they had a different teacher, you have to use all the tools at your disposal, randomization if you can, various techniques of good observational studies if you can't, and always, always remember that you must be modest in your claims when the uncertainty introduced by what you did not observe is of the same order of magnitude as the phenomena suggested by what we did observe. So the trick is to control hubris and make only modest changes. And I'd like to conclude in terms of value-added models with the advice that Mae West gave, that if it's worth doing slowly. Thank you. I guess I should, this is a sage academic institution. I shouldn't end with Mae West. Sir Hosea Charles Stamp said, "The government is extremely fond of amassing great quantities of statistics. These are raised to the nth degree, the cube roots are extracted, and the results are arranged into elaborate and impressive displays. What must be kept ever in mind, however, is that in every case, the figures are first put down by a village watchman, and he puts down anything he damn well pleases." So think about that when you look at U.S. News and World Report. And then finally, returning to Richard Feynman, for successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. Thank you again.
Formerly the Executive Director for Strategic Research and Analysis at the Louisiana Department of Education. His work has focused on improving children's access to a high-quality education and effective mental health services for those in need. Dr. Noell has been engaged in a multi-year project to examine how to use student educational outcomes as an indicator of the quality of teacher preparation. This led to Louisiana's first in the nation statewide system for linking teacher preparation to the educational attainment of students taught by new teachers. Dr. Noell also has focused on methods to improve the quality of services provided to children who are at risk and who are disabled. In addition to his research contributions, Dr. Noell has worked with agencies at the state and federal level to improve the quality of educational and mental health services available to children. His scholarship has been acknowledged through his receipt of grants, research awards, journal editorial board appointments, including editor-in-chief. In addition, he is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, a member of the Society for the Study of School Psychology, and he received the LSU Distinguished Faculty Award. George's talk today is based on his as I mentioned, nearly decade-long longitudinal study of teacher preparation programs in the state of Louisiana that uses value-added modeling to link teacher preparation with teacher quality and student learning outcomes. His talk will highlight the myriad of pitfalls and challenges of such work as it relates to data availability, management, measurement, and analysis, including, as we've been forewarned by Howard Wainer, on the role of value-added modeling in such work. The title of his talk, Making Educational Decisions in the Face of Uncertainty, the Case of Value-Added Assessment of Teacher Preparation.
Good morning, everybody. I'm, for those of you who know my work, or even just from Sharon's introduction, a bit more hopeful about the utility of value-added than Howard, and that'll come out as we go along. I suspect, given the context, I'm a little bit like the illegitimate child at the family reunion. We'll muddle through, and I appreciate that there are a lot of folks who have reasonable objections. Hopefully we'll have a little time to talk about those. And I guess my being more hopeful about their utility has to do with findings from a number of studies in terms of the predictability year to year, the effect of the findings about value added when there's randomization, and the work we've been doing. But anyway, I'm actually going to start by taking a broader lens at a moment, because the original billing of the session was about standardized testing in general. And I'll kind of come back at the end to the work that I've been doing in a specific area. But one of the things that I've done in my career is I left the university for several years to work in government, and have since been working with governments a lot around making educational policy decisions. And one of the things that's been really compelling, Howard and I talked about some at dinner last night, was the issue that decisions are going to get made, right? So there's legislatures, governors, state superintendents, state commissioners are going to make decisions about educational policy, funding, rules, laws, teacher accreditation, university accreditation, et cetera. And the question is, what's the basis going to be? And the realization I've had in the work that I've had to do in the policy halls of the United States at the state and the federal level is that the first place that people begin to make those decisions is really around their personal experience. So in talking with some very prominent and important elected officials who've wanted to pass laws, making dramatic changes to educational policy, curriculum, accreditation, whatnot, we'll start with, well, when I was in school, okay, and in some cases, this is the third most powerful elected official in the state who was last in school 35 years ago. Right, so when I was in school, I had this experience. So Dr. Noell, we want to get rid of the requirement for geometry in high school because nobody needs that stuff, right? Because my experience tells me I took it, I hated it, it was pretty miserable. I've never used it, and so I don't think we should make any kids have to know that geometry stuff, right? And interestingly, we can guffaw. We can, oh, how silly, how primitive, how backward, whatever. This is for real. This is how law gets made. Particularly if that person is a powerful elected official who has great sway over funds. And for that elected official, it's a sincere belief. This is not somebody who's messing around just to, whatever. I mean, they actually believe this, and they want the law changed, and they have the power to get the law changed. To be clear, if you have not had that experience in your state, this is a real deal that affects, in my case in Louisiana, millions of children, or in some other states we've worked with, many millions, in our state, hundreds of thousands, millions over time. And so how do you begin to build a case to make some kind of alternative decision? One other state that I was working with not too long ago, who basically, their state commissioner came to the conclusion, he said, George, I recently realized that nothing we've ever measured about teacher preparation in our state matters. We have no evidence that any of this elaborate process we've been going through for years around teacher preparation, that any of this matters. Can you dissuade me of that? And said, no, Commissioner, that's true. Nothing you know matters. He says, well, I think what I want to do, because I'm sick of it. I'm sick of the fight. I'm sick of the bickering, I'm sick of the pettiness of it. Since none of it matters, is I want to deregulate this space. So basically what I want to do is I want to take the state brand of approval or seal off of everybody and create a free market, because nothing is so evil as a monopoly, and nothing is evil or more evil yet than a government endorsed monopoly. So I just want to create a free market and let schools hire whoever they want, and then we'll sort it out. And again, this was not somebody just trying to be sensational. This was a person of great power in a large, populous, wealthy state who was sincerely toying with the idea of completely doing away with any kind of certification of teacher preparation programs because he believed that he had no evidence that they mattered. And so my great struggle in this kind of working in this policy space is some of the things that people say don't ring as plausible, but how do you marshal evidence to consider that maybe it would be good for kids to study geometry, or maybe it would be good to have some standards for who can become a teacher, or maybe it would be good to have. And so what can we marshal to begin to engage in a poly discussion? And I'll go ahead, and if you haven't had these experiences working in the halls where the laws are made, to say it is almost always the case that the elected official who's come to the idea that we should do away with geometry, do away with teacher licensure and certification, do away with whatever, based on his or her personal experience, probably is not winnable. They probably have already made their decision. The question is all the other elected officials who are on the fence, what could you marshal to talk to them that would make them see that maybe this is an ill-advised policy? The problem is, as soon as you do, you narrow the conversation, right? So if I go to test score data, that doesn't tell me anything about kindergartners. It doesn't necessarily tell me anything about high school graduation rate. It doesn't tell me about mental health outcomes. I'm a psychologist. I work with mental health stuff all the time, about which I'm very concerned, right? So as soon as I choose some evidence, inevitably I eliminate other evidence, and that becomes part of the back and forth. And then how do we decide what the right standards for evidence are? And one of the things that has become clear to me, or at least I may be wrong, but it's at least what I believe, is that we are in a case in which decisions are being made, the train is moving down the tracks at great speed, and consequential decisions are getting made now. And if we don't have the evidence to make decisions now, or to influence or inform the decisions to some degree, they're going to get made anyway. And so in some ways, although I am certainly sanguine about Howard's concerns about missing data, and be happy to talk about how we've dealt with it, including additional and heroic data collections and verifications and all kinds of stuff, is saying that because we can't know everything, we shouldn't know what we can't use what we do know, seems to me self-defeating. So I'll give a short analogy that I've used about my own reservations about some of my own value-added work. So that, for example, I've been asked by policymakers any number of times, so have you shut down any colleges of education yet? Because they've had bad value-added results, and the state has not, nor would I advocate that they do. We have not yet, but there's a different, because closing a college of education over poor value-added results would say that, for example, in Louisiana, we have a very vibrant French education tradition because of our cultural history. So I know nothing about the French educators from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. There's no value-added data on them. To make any decision about them from their value-added data would be stupid in the extreme. It's the kind of extreme case of missing data. On the other hand, if I have data that I think are informative, which we'll share some with you, about the reading or math outcomes or science or social studies outcomes about the elementary program at that university over a number of years, and it's of grave concern and it's not getting better, then I think at some point one has to ask a question about, and you've done due diligence around checking for alternate plausible explanations, which I'll talk a little bit about that too. At some point the question becomes, why wouldn't you act? Because there are two important competing interests, right? If the data are right, there's a group of children who are being misserved year after year after year in a very predictable repeating pattern, versus the university, which if you take some action about their elementary prep program, it has adverse consequences for them. But at some point you have to weigh this. But this idea that, or the idea that sometimes gets floated by academics, and I'm an academic, I have great sympathy for academics, that we should just defer the decisions until we have these ideal future time measures is hopeless. Because by the time you get there, A, the measures, as it turns out, never turn out to be available. We never get this ideal future state. And number two, the decisions are getting made today. And so the question isn't about what you would like. It's about how you can make the decisions in the reality you're living with now. So quickly, so standardized test score, whether we like them or not, high scores predict various life outcomes, including income, life expectancy, employment, et cetera. There's additional data that gain scores predict additional benefits above status, that people who are learning more have even better outcomes. Scores are a common anchor that are amenable to independent judgment. So we have the scores. We can argue about what they mean if we have too much missingness. By the way, the extent to which your opportunity to game the system is really driven by your state policy. So, for example, some of the field trip stuff, Louisiana has a very simple and very draconian system for solving that, which is you are penalized more heavily for a kid not taking the test than for a kid doing badly. There are always more points available for the school in having the kid there than there is in having the kid not there. As a result, we have exceedingly low missingness. Schools go out of their way to round up even their lowest achieving kids and get them into school because the penalty for non-participation is higher than the penalty for having them have a bad outcome. They, by their nature, create vast bodies of missing data, not necessarily about the students who are participant, but the subjects in areas where we don't take the data to begin. So we certainly shouldn't be making decisions about kindergarten based on standardized achievement tests where we don't collect it. And they're almost never useful except when they're anchored to something that we care about, which I'll give you an example outside of teacher prep, which I think is simple, intuitive, not statistically complicated, that was very compelling to me during my time in government. So what are the consequences of testing? That was part of the bill of the session. Other than we spend money, which is not inconsequential, testing per se has very little consequential value. States did it for a long time without rules or policies or laws. And it was used as a kind of a clarion call about race and class differences, low achievement levels in certain areas, and whatnot. It provided information, but they weren't very much done with it until NCLB. Except, well, in a few states, Louisiana was different in that regard. But the question really, I think, is not so much about testing, but is what do we do about it? And for those of you who would not be of this mindset, it's an interesting, one of the state that I was working with where there was a big push to dramatically scale back testing, eliminate it if they could, which they couldn't because of federal law, but dramatically scale it back. There were both folks who basically fundamentally objected to standardized achievement measures of human beings, that they argued from a kind of a humanistic, liberal, hopeful perspective that human beings can't be measured by tests. Being a psychologist, I don't agree, but that was kind of where they were, and I can respect that view. There was also a group of folks who wanted to do away with the test, partly because of the public policy problems it would solve for them. Because if we don't have data about reading achievement, there can't be a black-white difference because we can't see it. There can't be urban, suburban, rural differences anymore because we can't. And so one of the things in the question about what do we assess and how do we assess it is recognizing that there are many motivations for not wanting to have data available. It's a bit like saying, you know, I don't know how many of you guys are concerned about your weight. We're Americans, probably most of us, lots of us. I don't know how many of you weigh yourself on a regular basis. I made a determination to lose some weight a while back, and being a psychologist and knowing what I know about behavior change, I've made a very simple deal with myself, which is I weigh myself every morning, and I put it in an app on my iPhone, and I graph it, and I make myself look at it twice a day. Particularly right before meals is helpful. If I was really serious about getting it, I would post it online so you could all see it. I haven't gone that far. Because one of the things we know is that accountability and visibility causes behavior change. By the way, so over time, this little very simple intervention for me caused me to successfully make a lot of other behavior changes gradually, gave up the sugary soft drinks and whatnot because I wanted that number to go down, right? But there's still this crazy variability in day-to-day weights that is irritating. Your weight goes up, your weight goes down. And so one thing I could do is I could curse the scale and say, I'm going to get rid of the scale, problem solved. Or I could say, well, there must be something wrong with the scale. And there's measurement error in the scale, no doubt. Or it could be that there's real underlying variability in how much salt I've had to eat and what I had at dinner last night. By the way, dinner was great. Thank you. And on and on. It is a dangerous place to go, though, consequentially in terms of driving outcomes, to say we're going to stop measuring if we don't think about what the policy consequences are. And I absolutely agree with Howard in the sense of going reasonably slow. By the way, for those of you guys who've not had a chance to work in government but may at some point, going slow also becomes code in certain contexts of do nothing. Because if I go slow, in 4 years there'll be a new election cycle and it won't be my problem anymore. And then the next guy can come in and say, you know, I've done some work, collaborated some with colleagues in Massachusetts. And so tremendously high performing state, but one of the most pernicious black-white achievement gaps in the country. You know, and we really at some point should get serious about how to solve that. But let's study it for a while, and the solutions are probably going to upset some people. So let's go slow, and at the end of the study, we can do something. But by the time the study comes out, it's the next governor. And so we can study it again. And so there is this weird tension between let's go slow and make sure we've got the right answer, and another one that really, really resonates with me in a very strong and very painful way, working in a poor state with high rates of illiteracy and child failure and negative child outcomes, which is there are 65 to 75,000 kindergartners in Louisiana this fall who this is the only kindergarten year they're ever going to get. That's it. And if we can't do something to make their life experience better, to give them a better chance to be literate, successful, participate in the democracy, have choice, have economic security, then the opportunity for that group of kids is gone forever. And so there is this weird tension between going fast and doing stupid things, or waiting until we kind of know the complete right answer, and perhaps delaying doing something that might have improved kids' lives who were, well, anyway, that we could have made a difference now, should have made a difference now. So this is a non-statistically elaborate plot. I'll explain it right quick. One of the kinds of uses I've been using, I have used standardized achievement outcome data to look at an important social problem outside of teacher value added. So Louisiana has a pretty high high school dropout rate. And there has been off and on significant work in Louisiana to try to improve that. We have made substantial progress. We moved out of the bottom 3 states in the country into the next, we got into what our rank was into the low 30s, 38, 39, so, which is pretty awful, but less awful, directionally correct. But at one point when I was in government, we were working on that. And so one of the things my team did for some key leaders in the state was we produced this plot. And all this plot shows you is the number of non-graduates at each high school in the state by plotted against the average standardized achievement test score for those kids when they were rising 8th graders in Louisiana, rising 9th graders actually, their 8th grade test scores. And we did this for a couple of reasons. One is the state had limited resources to begin to direct at this problem. And so we began to think about targeting those resources smartly. So where are the places where there are lots of kids you could make an impact on? Obviously. So if you take one of the schools to the far left of the plot, where they've got 10 kids who aren't graduating, you can put all the resources there you want, but there's only 10 kids to, quote, save. On the other hand, if you're out here on the far right where a school is producing 150 dropouts a year, there are a tremendous number. So that was one little piece of information, just knowing where the kids are who aren't graduating. The other part is very interesting. Our state standardized achievement test has a theoretical mean of 300. It's actually more like 302, 303. But it's so close to 300, we just call it 300 for talking purposes. And this plot showed something else that was a big surprise to elected officials. They assumed dropouts were low-achieving kids. That's who we have in our worldview of who drops out of high school as kids who are low-achieving. What this data showed is there are a consequential number of schools who have large numbers of kids who are dropping out, whose average test scores, and this is their scores not of the school, but of the kids who dropped out, who have large numbers of kids who are above average academically in math and English. And so one of the things that led to was this kind of conversation about, do we need differentiated strategies by the kind of school we're approaching? So if you are in that top right quadrant, the blue quadrant, where you have kids who are theoretically, it appears, predominantly academically prepared, do we need to understand something different about why those kids in those schools are dropping out versus in the bottom right quadrant or the bottom left quadrant where the kids appear to be academically underprepared or at least somewhat marginal. But everybody seemed to think that that dropouts would on average pretty much all be below average kids in terms of reading and math achievement, which turns out not to be the case. Now, if you had all the data unpacked, there's a significant correlation or relationship between academic underpreparedness and dropping out. The problem is that the distribution is much, much broader than anybody ever thought about. And so this actually led to an office being developed in the State Department of Education to support high schools, to support more kids being successful in completing schools, who then conceptualized their work in a different way, which was to develop a portfolio of services to reach out to high schools that would be tailored to the high school's needs. Kind of a crazy idea. And would be proactive, which I love these folks. I enjoyed working with them enormously. So they didn't say, we have a portfolio of services, it's on the web, call us if you'd like a hand. They developed account managers who went out to high schools and said, you know, principal, I'm sorry to tell you this, I don't know if you do this, but you're the third highest producer of dropouts in the state. But your kids are pretty academically prepared when they get to you. How can we help you? Let us show you some things that we have to offer. And so this is something in the absence of standardized achievement test data we would not ever have had available to us. And just as a footnote, the level of missingness in these data because of our testing policies are enormously low. And not zero, but enormously low. Another policy challenge. Does teacher preparation matter? There's considerable evidence of many kinds that teachers matter, both observational studies, the class, the Charlotte Danielson's framework, observational studies, value-added data points in the same direction. There's really just lots of consequential reasons to believe that teachers matter. But until recently, there's been almost no evidence regarding teacher preparation, which is weird. My spouse is a teacher educator. I spend a lot of time with teacher educators. I like schools. I like teachers. I've always assumed that it mattered. To be clear, if you didn't realize this, there are consequential numbers of elected officials at this point and appointed officials who don't believe it matters, who have gotten to the place where I was sharing some data with some staff on the Hill showing less effective teachers by people who were unprepared to teach the content they were teaching. And the response from one of the staff members was, yeah, but are those smart uncertified teachers? Because if they were just smart enough, they wouldn't have needed any preparation. And I said, well, you know, I don't want to embarrass anybody by speaking out of turn, but I will just say that I told the person, I don't have IQ tests. I have no idea. Smart, not smart. I just know that they're the uncertified teachers we had. And there's large administrative testing databases that might be leveraged to provide some uniform outcome data along some dimensions in some areas. Accepting the proposition that teachers matter creates a new problem around thinking about teacher preparation, which is teacher preparation is not a simple enterprise. There's the actual preparation that goes on, what happens in classes, field experiences, mentorships, yada, yada, on and on. But there's also an admissions component, and then there's a placement component. Who goes out, who actually lands in teaching. And so, for example, based on some of the data that are out there that, which are not as much as I might like at this point, but there's certainly a group of folks who feel like that the preparation itself is pretty irrelevant, that it's all about recruitment. That teacher prep programs, if you look at the TFA data, the TNTP data, some of the more exclusive institutions that, you know, if you just get really smart young people and have them come hang out at a university, for 4 years, it'll be okay. Now, I will say that there is some, at least in the value-added space, some some data that would argue that that is not the case out of some of the North Carolina studies, which we can talk about if folks have interest. One of the interesting things working in this space for me, however, has been the recognition that when you try to talk to higher ed and K-12 education and elected officials simultaneously, so first of all, take your medications first, because getting all three, because it's like okay, are there problems? Everybody's yes. Whose fault is it? And everybody points to the right. Or maybe sometimes they do that, but everybody's sure it's not at their place. You know, if the universities would just give us better teachers, K-12 would be great. If the legislature would just give us more money and freedom and less regulation, that would be great. If we just deregulated the whole dang thing and got rid of all of these people over here and made it private sector, everybody's sure that the solution involves something that goes on in someone else's space. But if you go look at the data, basically what you have is a K-12 universe based on high school graduation rates, suspension rates, expulsion rates, job placement rates, standardized achievement test data rates, whatever you want, that suggests there are consequential places we ought to be concerned. Not every school, not every student, not every school district, but that there are lots of places in America where we are underperforming, where we should do better by our children if we're going to have them. It would be an interesting deal. So before you can have a baby, are you willing to commit to making sure that your baby has an excellent school? What would that do to the birth rate? Anyway. Oddly enough, when you go talk to higher ed folks, there's nothing in their data to suggest that they have anything to be worried about. Graduates pass their state licensing exam. When they fill out satisfaction surveys, the 25% who respond, they all say, oh, it was lovely. My 6 years at NYU were some of the best years of my life. By the way, you should survey Marines about their experiences. They also think that the Marines was a social justification thing. I spent 6 years. It was terribly unpleasant, but it must have been good for me because what a moron I would be if I did that and it wasn't good for me. But anyway. And you survey principals. They love their new teachers. I did a really good job picking my new teacher, so that must reflect some well on you too. They get jobs. So there was nothing in the data that teacher prep programs were looking at that suggested that they had any problems. And so trying to figure out why the disconnect. And part of the reason I would argue is because we weren't looking at the same data. One was a group of, in essence, adult perceptual data, and the other was student outcome data. And there was no data connecting teacher preparation and K-12 outcomes. I mentioned this before. This is just a slide I grabbed right quick, and I'll just mention. So one of the things that, from one of our state reports, these are simply data with value-added coefficients for teachers who are not certified in this area. Now, these are not, most of them are actually not uncertified teachers. Many of these are certified teachers. They're just teaching out of area. And so on the test scale of score of our state standardized test, it shows that having a teacher teaching a mathematics, whether they're completely uncertified or not certified to teach math, kids did worse. And that same in English, reading, science, social studies, so forth, all statistically small but statistically significant effects. Interestingly, I mean, it is evidence that teacher preparation matters, that actually being prepared, being endorsed and being certified by the state to teach in an area actually had some actual value. And again, these are data that some elected officials look at and say, well, that can't be right. Because we've heard over and over again that teacher certification doesn't matter, that teacher preparation doesn't matter, so there must be something wrong here. And maybe it's a phenomenon, maybe it only matters in Louisiana. I don't know, maybe where we go to get our uncertified teachers, maybe it's scarier than where people in New York, in you wealthy, liberal, more highly educated eastern states go to get your uncertified teachers. Or maybe it's something else, heck, I don't know. So the challenges of assessing in teacher preparation, which are thorny and tough. There's achievement versus opinions, or some kind of measurement, quantifiable measurement versus opinion. By the way, I can tell you, having worked on this in a number of different ways in a number of places, the discourse without a factual base that we can all challenge and look at and bounce off of and argue about what it means, without that kind of anchor to something, whether it's this or something else, seems circular, endless, and never going anywhere. I would personally never agree to get back into that again, because it just went round and round and round and round. And if there is no way to test or create a fact base against which to test, it seems like it just goes on. The dimensionality of the problem, teacher prep has lots of potential outcomes, and we're not going to measure them all. And so how do we assess what we can, whether that's employer surveys, persistence in teaching, success of first-year evaluations, value-added measures, whatever. No measure we'll ever get will catch it all. I will say this. One of our deans of one of our teacher prep programs told me, he said, well, George, I don't think it's fair that you're giving us these value-added measures for the reading performance because you don't know anything about our early elementary K1, 2 teachers, and maybe they're doing great. To which I said, Jerry, that's a beautiful argument. I just thoroughly disagree because your reading teachers are disastrously ineffective in the grades where we have data, and let me put it to you this way. It's a little bit to me like telling me that my oldest son is at home and we just took his temperature and he has a fever of 103. But I shouldn't do anything about it or tell my wife or tell his pediatrician because my younger son's still at school and I haven't been able to measure his temperature yet. And maybe when I knew something about his temperature, that would change my view of the world or whatever. I feel like we ought to act on the things we can know and work to know the other things we don't know that we should know when we can get there. So obviously geography is a huge challenge, spread out. Heterogeneous schools and classes. Florida did an amazing thing at one point, which is they published standardized achievement data against their teacher prep programs with no prior controls. And they found that the worst teacher prep programs sent all of their graduates to the highest need schools and school districts. And the best ones all went to suburban school districts. Wonder how that worked out. So how you come up with reasonable controls, and then the plausible counterfactual. And I suspect this will be a place where Howard and I will just have to agree to disagree in terms of building a case for what would be the plausible counterfactual. It's true, just in a randomized treatment study as I do with child behavior therapy, I never see the child under the treatment condition because they got randomized to the control. And so the question is how do you build a strong enough case that it's reasonable that you would know? And that, given that I've got about 5 minutes left, maybe we'll get to a bit in the discussion, but I think we can make a reasonable case, particularly when data are stable, and we've ruled out some other things. There are big issues around test quality. We could talk about some data quality and how you test and make sure you have decent longitudinal connections, that you have good data around teacher quality and certification. These are, by the way, a lot of this part of the thing where there are great challenges are really solvable technical problems if states will commit to do them. And I can talk through some, if folks have interest, around states that I think have done a brilliant job of, for example, making sure that the student-teacher data connections are vetted and that they're accurate, that teachers are seeing them, that all you have to do is, in some ways, is shine the sunshine on it and let everybody see it. And when everybody sees it, things get straightened out, as opposed to having it being hidden and nobody knows and it's not clear that it matters. That won't solve the counterfactual problem, but a lot of the data quality issues are really solvable by policy and investment. There is mixed data around whether or not teacher prep programs matter. Most of the value-added studies suggest that they do. Kerry Codal and folks in Missouri have the one kind of counter study that I know of that's running right now, where they looked at Missouri's traditional pathways and found them all to be statistically indistinguishable. And it is true that some of the bigger variance has to do with studies that include a wider variety of types of programs. There's the New York Pathway study right here that found some program features matter or suggested that they did based on value-added measures. And there is a lot of debate and argument. Well, there's a lot of argument. I don't think that I have a strong position on this, so about what predictors other than tests you should include. I think there's a mountain of evidence, for example, that the older traditional layered model that Bill Sanders developed in Tennessee is wrought with some huge flaws that are solvable. Then there may be other flaws that are less solvable, but there are some definite issues there with the treatment of disabled kids, class composition effects and whatnot. Okay, so right quick to wrap up. So the impact of schools and districts is a big challenge. This is a slide that just shows data from a very high-performing and a very low-performing district, teacher prep program in Louisiana. The blue bar is running the models against the state. The red bar is running the models against the districts in which those teachers taught. Basically, it shows, yeah, there's some differences, but they're not consequential. Whether you run state-level models or whether you run district-level models, you would reach the same conclusions about who's effective and ineffective. We've also done some propensity match studies, which, again, produce roughly the same results. And we get the same results across years. The highest and lowest performing programs in Louisiana are consistent. So it doesn't matter if you run within district models. It doesn't matter whether you run propensity matched models. and the models are consistent in terms of pointing to areas of concern year over year over year. I'm not saying I've proven that those are the worst programs in the state. I am saying, as a citizen of the state, I think it would be inappropriate for the state not to pursue that further, because there are kids on the receiving ends of those teachers. And by the way, we've also done work, which is not in this slide, doing crossed comparisons with with programs inside districts that would point to the same deal. There are a ton of concerns about value added globally, which just because I'm running out of time, I'm going to skip. I want to share with you really just two quick thoughts as I've run out of time and wrap up here. Is one of the unique advantages of teacher prep value added as opposed to the individual is the ability to examine large numbers of individuals in many settings crossed with many other teacher preparation programs. One of the unique challenges of looking at individual teachers is always the problem, you're looking at Mrs. Jones, or in my state, Mrs. Guidry or Mrs. Hebert, in the specific context in which she is in, which is different than looking at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette in 100 different classrooms over 35 or 45 different districts, crossed with many other districts, other programs, in which you get to see them teaching many different kinds of kids in many different kinds of contexts. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it certainly helps. So there are some big challenges from moving from the data to the actions, which is most importantly with teacher prep is the time to effect. So if you detect a problem, you have a concern, you begin to make changes, because we've been at this long enough that we're actually have that kind of data now, that it takes a while to change the program, then it takes a while to train people, and then it takes a while for them to go graduate, for you to get another look at the problem to see if you've made any progress. However, kudos to my colleagues at Louisiana Resource Center for Educators. This is a kind of a closing, one of my favorite slides of all the work I've done. So Louisiana Resource Center for Educators had the zero line here represents the average experienced teacher. And this is the number of points off on our standardized achievement tests in our state that would be associated with a new teacher from that program. Louisiana Resource Center for Educators is an alternative pathway to teaching that is a big going concern in Louisiana. And what we found was that they, in 2007, 2008, 2009, had some of the least effective new teachers in reading in the state. As a result, they chose, at that time it was completely at their discretion, there were no policy around this, to bring in some very top-notch national consultants and a local consultant to look at their reading program and say, well, what do you see? Does this look good? Does it look bad? I know one of the people who worked with them, and her observation was, it looks terrible. I can't believe your data aren't worse. And they made thoroughgoing changes, and this is what happened to their value-added data as the newly trained teachers began to enter the workforce. And their scores went up. They've actually, there's a 12 data point now, which I didn't get in the slide, which is, I believe, yet a little bit better, but not a whole lot. They didn't go from last to first, but they certainly got to be comparable with other new teacher prep programs. Now again, I can't prove that this is just time series data, can't prove that the changes they made are what caused the bump. I did throw up their math data, which they didn't do anything in math, and not much happened in math. Something we observe over and over again. If you don't do anything different, neither will the kids. But it does suggest that they are malleable, at least. And some of the, by the way, some of the issues with cheating here, I am less concerned about, because it is very hard for a teacher prep program to reach out to their graduates as they distribute it over the state and in some way manipulate what's going on in these many classrooms and districts. Actually, they complain they have a hard time finding their graduates, much less manipulating results. So some final quote, how do we act wisely without overreacting? Folks talk a great deal about, well, we need multiple indicators, and who could be against multiple indicators? Just tell me what they are, and how they matter, and what we would do about them. How do we decide how much information we have to have before we would make a decision? How do we weigh the interests of adults and children? So there are folks who will argue that we shouldn't do this because it'll hurt teachers. Okay? I don't want to hurt teachers. I love schools. I love teachers. But how do I weigh that against the reality that the kids are moving through the system right now, and for many children we're not serving them well, and we know who we're not serving well. And I can tell you from looking at value-added data from multiple states, there are teachers and there are programs, teacher prep programs, that are consistently year over year over year underperforming. So even if we just limit it our focus of worry about that. Should we do something with that, or should we say, the methodological challenges are too heroic to overcome, so we should just decide we don't know that? I would say that the LRCE example and others would suggest that maybe not. Maybe we should do something. And then the kind of the choice around what are the key potential indicators and predictors of outcome and who decides the right course. One of the things that I have found fascinating as value-added models have gotten developed and adopted by several states is the extent to which non-technical groups make key decisions. So certain kinds of variables, so I was involved in a policy discussion actually in Washington in which I was told that critical officials had decided that they did not want students' disabilities in value-added models because they felt like that would lower expectations for disabled kids, and all teachers should be teaching to the same standards. And these are folks who normally consider me an ally, and I looked back and I said, have you met a child with mental retardation? I mean, do you understand what it means to say, we know these things about kids with significant disability? Have you seen the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act? I mean, that we know these things about these kids, and we're going to purposefully put our hands over our eyes about it when we know that there are big differences. We have solid evidence because it points to an inconvenient political truth. And so how do you get to kind of this interchange between smart policy based on fact and the reality that there are strong, passionately held, sincerely believed philosophical, moral positions in which people want to do things that at least technically seem crazy, to not put too fine a point on it. So Sharon, I will stop. I apologize. I know I'm over slightly. So please come forth and moderate.
The operative words here are facing uncertainty and dealing with all the constraints and problems that we have in coming up with credible conclusions based on data that we can believe to be valid, reliable, and stable. And so let me just invite you all to ask questions of our panelists. We have until 10:30 only, and so please, any questions? I should say that. Anybody? Yes.
Hi. My name is Peter Goodman. A friend of mine is doing some research comparing student outcomes based upon the amount of tuition students paid to get their degree in college. I told him when he publishes his data, he should have someone else start his car in the morning. But my question is, in New York State, they've just put in place this greatly enhanced teacher preparation model. But 80% of teachers in New York State who get certification in elementary education have not gotten jobs within 2 years. So that if people aren't getting jobs, because there are all kinds of cuts and things like that, the decisions on who gets hired are really skewed because lots of the graduates who might be potential candidates go seek other things to do. So is the data really meaningful if our great candidates really can't get jobs? In other words, it goes back to what Dr. Wainer said about missing data. So are we really doing all kinds of research, but it really is not, but it's really skewed by the realities of the marketplace?
All right. So placement rates are inevitably a challenge here. And so one of the things you have to understand if you approach looking at this stuff is what's the marketplace in which you work. So in Louisiana, we don't have this phenomenon. We are a traditional teacher shortage state with traditional importation of new teachers. So we don't have the majority of our, even anything like the majority of our teachers not being able to be placed. There's a tension here in terms of you can't know about the folks who didn't come into teaching, right? And so if you did know about them, would it change what you conclude? And this is a particular challenge for a lot of northeastern states that either have been very high producers, are experiencing lots of contraction either in population or hiring, or traditional exporter states like Ohio, produces a tremendous excess of teachers and exports them to various states all around the country. There's the tension with that versus even in a state like my own, where we're a mild shortage state, so most of our folks who want to teach. There are always teachers who choose to go to Texas, they weren't from Louisiana, and we lose them. And so there's this tension about, so are we really trying to figure out how we're doing about teachers in general, whether they teach or not, go into the military, go to another state, or are we trying to figure out how we're doing with the teachers who actually enter teaching, or teaching in our state? I know from our legislature's perspective, they're really interested in the people who go into teaching in our state, because that's who they care about, and they'll be pretty gruff about, I'm not concerned about people who go someplace else, I'm concerned about the people who teach our kids. But it is, I mean, inevitably it's a challenge. It's certainly a challenge that deans and chancellors raise all the time, which is, oh, well, you don't know about my I've literally had a program that didn't do very well say, well, you don't know about our graduates who leave to go to Arkansas and Texas. And of course, because salaries are higher in Texas, all of our best candidates are going to Texas, so you're just getting the bottom of our distribution. Interestingly, when you push back on that in a moment, say, wow, that's an interesting, and that they know that about themselves, and you know that about themselves, and the Texas employers know that. Where's the evidence that the good ones are the ones who are going? Because we could really use that to change things, and of course, there isn't any. They just say, oh, it must be. And so it's a complicated issue. If it is the case in this state that only 20% of new teachers can find jobs, I think there's a bigger policy challenge there around communicating with prospective teachers what their risk is, and talking about, you know, why, if you've got an 80% chance of needing to either leave the state or go do something else, I think the policy implications there to me actually start by resonating to the candidates themselves.
Hi, my name is Leonie Hameson. I run an organization called Class Size Matters in New York City, and my question is to Dr. Wainer.
Your name is Leonie?
Leonie Hameson, yeah.
And you
run an organization called Class Size.
I'm old, you have to speak clearly. Class
Size Matters, an evidence-based reform. Okay. The skepticism among experts on value-added teacher evaluation is long-standing. And in fact, the National Academy of Sciences, which generally represents the consensus of experts on issues, came out with not one, but two reports basically saying, in response to Race to the Top, and then later, that this is not something we should trust. This is not something that should be embedded in policy. It's really quite speculative. And yet, of course, the national education policy and state policies are going in the opposite direction. And the Federal Department of Education is denying waivers to states that have not adopted value-added teacher evaluation, and seems immune to the expert opinions of people who know things about statistics. My question is twofold. First of all, because you also have some expertise in the medical area, I would just like you to contrast, is this true also with healthcare policy at a national or a state level, that they generally just ignore what the expert views are on policy and just go ahead anyway? And my other question is, it seems like the biggest argument about people on the other side is that the current teacher evaluation system is so bad that anything would be better than what we have now. And even if we make mistakes, we need a better system, so why not try this? And what's your response to that? Thanks.
Well, that's a terrific question. I think I'll stay away from the medical part. My salary depends on but the experts that you're quoting about the flaws in value-added measurement are correct. That's a fact. I'll give one example. A couple of years ago, there was this horrific thing that showed up in the Los Angeles Times, in which they published the value-added scores of every teacher in, I think, Los Angeles or maybe California. And they said, look, with their names. And they said, well, we have this wonderful result. And the result was that students the students in 5th grade that did well are the ones who had teachers who had higher value-added scores in 4th grade. And so the implication was, if you had a good teacher in 4th grade, you did better in 5th grade. And that was cited as being supportive of the validity of value-added estimates. What they didn't mention is that students who did well in 5th grade are students who had teachers who had high value-added scores in 6th grade. And the one thing we do know from Hume is that typically causes come before effects, except for physicists. I mean, the joke about the bartender says, "What'll you have?" and 2 neutrinos came into a bar. Time goes, and that's. So the point is that there's no connection. The implication is that the value-added score that a teacher has is not independent of the ability of the students, and so the students who seem to be doing well get the teachers. Get certain teachers, and they have high value-added scores because of so the causal arrow is in the other direction. The most terrifying thing is when completely sensible people like George start saying, "Well, here's the value-added scores." The catastrophe is that we have these numbers, and people somehow reify them and think of them as somehow critically important, when in fact they are terrifyingly inaccurate. The causal implications that are being drawn from them are incorrect. I have a short story that I'll tell you. I was named to be on a committee called NAGB, the National Assessment Governing Board, and we had a meeting in Washington, and one of the people who addressed us was Arnie Duncan, and so I went to speak, and I wrote to Secretary Duncan and said we should be careful about this. And I went to speak with him. And I said, let me reintroduce myself. You know, we've met before. And he said, really, where? And I said, at dinner at your house. And he said, oh, when was that? And I said, September 1970. And he said, I was 6. And I said, that's right. His father and I were colleagues at Chicago, and he had invited us over. And little Arnie was giving me instructions about for my son about the school there. And I said, well, here, I think you ought to ease off on this pressure in Race to the Top for value added. I said, it's not well worked out yet. And he thanked me. He said, have you written something on this? And I said, sure. And he said, send it to me. So I did. And then about a month later, I got a letter saying that my services on the National Board weren't required. Don't you bring me no bad news. So I think the kinds of things that you're talking about, that completely sensible people somehow are so desperate for something that they'll accept this and hope that somehow we can work out the details. But they're not details. They're conceptual flaws, and they're causing damage. But George is correct that we have to do something. And so the question is what? And I think I didn't elaborate on Mae West well enough. When I said slow, what did I mean? I mean that suppose we're trying to build an improved educational system. The worst way to do this is to get a blue ribbon committee together with a name something like Education 2030 or something like that, and have them ponder it for a year or two and then put out a report that says this is what we do. It'll be a failure, and it's a failure because we're not that smart. We don't know what's going to work. And it represents a kind of hubris that the people who developed what we're doing now were idiots. They're not. What we should do, and to have the education system of the future, is to build a constant system of experimentation. And that is, if you think value added is going to work, install it in some small proportion of the places. Do it. Do it carefully. And keep track of how well it works, and do it right. If it works well, then try it in more places. If it doesn't work well, get rid of it. This is what's known in quality control methods. It's a common thing. Suppose the usual example is you have a paper factory, and when you manufacture paper, you have many variables you can change: the temperature, the acidity, the density, the speed, all sorts of things. And the way you optimize is you change one of them a little, and you see if it gets better. The reason you only change it a little is because you don't want to shut down the factory because it doesn't work anymore. You change it a little, and if it gets better, you change it some more. And if it gets better, you keep changing it. When it stops getting better, you move it back, and then you change something else. And you keep making these little changes, and then gradually the whole system optimizes. And the same thing was true with education. You make small changes, and by small, I mean either small in terms of the size of the change or small in terms of the number of units that are influenced by it. And if it works, spread it out, make it bigger, do more. And that way, when 2030 arrives, the education system of the future will arrive with it, a little bit at a time. And so if you're tasked with having to develop some sort of system, build in a constant experimental system with it, done in a rigorous way, where you agree in advance on what the dependent variable is going to be. If this gets better, it's good. If this doesn't get better, it's bad. And so do that. There was another phrase that I heard, which is...
Go ahead. What a fast favorite phrase?
I have a whole bunch of these things. Recommendations made without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. I think that's sensible. Yes, you have an orange shirt, which means you went to Princeton.
Can I just interrupt just for the second? Because I think the importance of something, I want to just emphasize the importance of something Howard is saying, and it's something that I commented on when I reviewed his book, and that is looking at that Bowdoin study, where he basically is saying that a recommendation would be to take people with higher SATs and lower SATs because they perform better. Well, there was, and I mentioned this in the review, back at Columbia College, there was a dean who decided that that should be the policy at Columbia College, to accept those students who had higher SATs than others. And that's what they did. Until the following year, they saw that the freshman class was composed of mostly Jews from New York, and the guy was called Dudley's Folly, and it was never done again. So the importance of what Howard is saying now, and I think what we all have to understand, is that we make changes, but then we have to be very careful in verifying that the changes that we made really move to improve things.
Was it bad to have more Jews? Because when Princeton went co-ed, it happened at the last minute, and so the women that were accepted, they didn't have all of the letters of record. They had a whole bunch of things they didn't have, and so they ended up choosing women simply on the basis of their SAT scores. And that entering class has outperformed any entering class since in terms of their rank on graduation. That entering class of women blew away everybody else. So it's not, I mean, there are other reasons for having, you don't want to always choose the higher SAT score. You need a Goldie. You need an oboe. You need all sorts of things. You need, you're idiotic if you don't want, if someone donates a building if their child doesn't get in. I mean, you can't have a successful school if you don't do things like that. But that's why you have to agree on the dependent variables.
Okay, with that, let's do it. Alyssa is one of my students, and so let's hear your question.
I am. Hi. So my name is Alyssa Treskowski-Geis, and I'm a doctoral student here at NYU in English education, but I've been swayed to the dark side of statistics. I'm going to offer a quick comment and then a question. I work on a research project with two professors who have a grant to study a very large value-added data set tied to video data. You might not going to mention the name of it, but it's been a real education for me because I was a teacher for 12 years before I decided to come back to school. And as a teacher, I would have been horrified to think that my performance in the classroom would be tied to my students' test scores, because there was a lot more going on for my students than what I was doing in the classroom, right? There was, the resources that they brought to bear, or the lack of resources that they brought to bear to the classroom. And what research shows us is that on an individual level, value added is not a very stable measure of teacher effectiveness, right? But as a researcher here, I realized that when I want to do a study of effective teachers of writing, somebody's going to ask me, how do you define effective? And so to have a group of teachers who have been sort of predefined as effective, and this is very pragmatic and maybe slightly cynical, but it's really useful to have this data. And I think that more recent research is showing that instead of looking at individual teacher outcomes for value added, we should look at groups of teachers. So I'm kind of curious to hear what both of you have to say on that. I think that If you look at groups of teachers as a teacher preparation program, and that's a group of teachers, what can be done with that information for the teacher prep program? And then, Dr. Wainer, what do you think about looking at versus the individual versus the group?
It'll be more stable because the sample size is larger. But that doesn't help you if you're measuring the wrong thing. So you just get a better estimate of something that isn't the right thing. I can imagine how frustrating it is because it gives you a number, and then a number means you can put it all together and make a graph. And how bad is that? But who was it? I guess it was Will Rogers that said, "What we don't know won't hurt us. It's what we do know that ain't." And we don't know enough yet certainly about the kinds of causal implications. We had this big value added because they had that teacher. The only way you can do that is if you have random assignment or something close to random assignment of students to teachers. Because if you have two teachers who start out with the same average ability student, then the differences that come out are based upon the teacher, obviously. But obviously that's not true either, because even if you have randomization and one teacher strictly at random gets Freddie, and Freddie has a bladder problem and disrupts the whole class, and so the scores go down. Now, had Freddie arrived at the other teacher, they would have had a problem. So the randomization only works in the very large, and not not in the moderate.
So maybe we can let George have a chance.
Yeah. So certainly my view on the value-added problem is somewhat different. So the randomized study in LA that tested it found it to be unbiased. If you look at Raj Chetty's study, kids who have exposure to high value-added teachers have better life outcomes. There's the correlation value-added year to year in what I would consider the more mature, better models state to state is better than the correlation year to year of batting averages for Major League Baseball players. Consequentially better, particularly in mathematics. And I would love to meet the Major League Baseball manager who says we should disregard batting average. We're just going to not use that in player selection. So I am more sanguine that it is useful, hopeful in moderation, and I particularly am encouraged in places where we're using it, where we can cross across many things like multiple teachers from the same teacher preparation program who are in different schools, different districts, different kinds of kids and whatnot, that we can learn more, and that the problems at the individual level are more difficult to track. Although I am personally very interested in these cases because of work I've done with states, of folks who are persistently over many years either very low performing or very high performing, where they don't drop out of that into the distribution. And that we know that when there's another paper I can think of offhand, where we know that when teachers move, that value-added scores, the correlation year to year diminishes, but it doesn't go away. That there's something that appears to be stable that is moving with them as they change context, grade levels, groups of kids, whatnot. So I think I think it would be disingenuous to argue that the folks who are hopeful and the folks who are supporting moving forward, at least the ones that I know of in the research community, are just making it up. I think there's lots of evidence. The question is there enough? Who judges that? And then there is really very dangerously and very worrisomely how that then hits policy. Because one of the things that, having had a hand in meeting with committee members to craft policy and law, is the love of the simple at the campaign level. So starting to talking about, if coming up with solutions that are nuanced, that would say there aren't very few automatics, that this would trigger scrutiny or concern and follow-up and whatnot, whereas an elected official likes, okay, if your value-added score is worse than this 2 years in a row, you're out of here, right? That you begin to see this like, whoa, we started out in one place, how did we end up there? But that's very packageable. You can put that on the flyer you mail to the people when you run for re-election. And so I think there are two great challenges, one of which is there's legitimate disagreement. That do we know enough, and if what we know is good enough? I would say that at least in terms of value added, it's what we know about its relationship to outcomes is at least as good, if not better, in other industries that use sales figures, batting averages, other performance metrics that are not perfect year to year, but predict long-term trends. Tom Kane had a nice blog piece the other day about what the relationship is between any year value added and a year to career as opposed to year, and it's much higher. So I think that the reality is, and the Met study with the stable versus the unstable part of VAM estimates, I think the issue is, which we're not, I mean, just not the time is that it's complicated, and there's lots of different pieces of evidence from different places. But I'm, you know, we're of different, I guess that's why we're both here, is because we wouldn't say the same thing. And how boring would it be if we just, you know, hugged and sang Kumbaya? I think it would be contrary to the policy breakfast's goal.
Exactly. Okay, on that note, I notice that it's 10:30, and so I want you to join me in thanking our two distinguished panelists.